continually exploit Black and Indigenous people, and we must be cognizant of that when we have conversations about racial justice. These conversations are intrinsically linked to conversations for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination and conversations about transnational solidarity. For those of you in Chicago, two organizations that we want to mention are the Chicago American Indian Community Collaborative and the American Indian Center of Chicago. So just some guidelines for this talk. Please remain muted during the talk. There'll be time for questions at the end. If you have any questions during the session, just go ahead and type them into the chat and they'll be compiled. There'll also be an opportunity for folks to turn on their mics during the question and answer as well. Just to give you sort of an overview of what we hope to talk about today is we want to build a case for the why of organizing. We want to give folks a starting point for developing your values and how they connect to intentional political work and intentional political community, and a framework for developing and building your analysis. So this is just an overview and a survey and some context to maybe try to appreciate in a little bit more depth the place that community organizing is coming from and the framework for the goals it hopes to achieve. So I'll just tell you quickly about the Chicago Health Coalition for Black Lives. This is a group of folks that came together after the murder of George Floyd and the uprising that followed. We have working groups working on defunding the police, on providing street medic services to people taking to the streets, for institutional resistance, so changing curricula, admissions procedures, and other struggles for justice occurring on our campuses around the city. And then this arm, which is the political education group, which is putting on this session today.
Cool. And then I'm Hwayan. I use she, her pronouns. I am an organizer actually based in Michigan. Sorry, not Chicago. And I started organizing in like a couple of years ago. I'm not sure at this point, but I've done organizing across a variety of issues, primarily starting with immigration because I am a daughter of Vietnamese refugees. And now I work as a digital organizer for a statewide organization in Michigan. And so we were just going to kick off the first part of this training. You can go to the next slide with sort of thinking about, First we wanted people to introduce themselves in the chat. So there are lots of you here, which is really cool. If you could just put your names, pronouns if you want, your affiliation, school, and year, and also why you're at this training. So what led you here? Maybe if you're excited to be here, you can say why. And then also if you can, please change your Zoom name to include your pronouns if you want. And you can just do that by clicking the 3 buttons on the side. So if people just want to write in the chat, you don't have to, but if people want to, please introduce yourself that way. We also wanted to have some norms and community agreements for this space, especially as we move into small groups for the last 20 minutes of the session. So the first one was just show up as you are. I know some folks have their video off, that's great. Whatever you need to do to just be comfy, particularly, this is a really weird time with the pandemic, and also trainings can be sort of difficult to sit through. So if you need to stand up, do that. If you need to go to the bathroom, do that. Whatever you need to do to feel comfy is perfect, which also leads into number 2. The third one, really thinking about how we're allowing ourselves to listen and learn, particularly when we begin to talk about harder concepts such as racial justice or inequities just in general in the world that we live in. It can be really difficult to actually sit and think about what those mean and what those mean to us. So we really are hoping that folks can just be open to that and open to being really intentional about listening here. The fourth one, taking space and making space. A lot of this will be us just talking to you for the first bit of it. So that won't really be as applicable, but particularly when we get into the small groups later, let's think about maybe how much space we're talking, how many times we're talking. Maybe let's see if other folks wanted to speak up as well. The fifth, asking questions and being curious. This is, somewhat of an informal presentation. We're all, sort of around the same age, all kind of doing similar things, except for me. And so make sure that you're feeling comfortable asking questions. If there's a word that you don't know, if there's something where you're like, wait a second, I have I'm not sure about this, ask it. And we definitely want to make space to be answering those. And then as we do these, I also wanted to just spend like a little bit of time seeing if people had anything else that they wanted to add to these norms and community agreements. And you can go off mute, or you can put it in the chat, or you don't have to do that at all. Cool. If something comes up, just be sure to just put that in, and that's totally fine. So we wanted to ground people in thinking about what this actually is, right? It's called Organizing 101, but there are always a billion 101s and they mean a lot of things. And why is it important? So when we're thinking about organizing spaces, right? A lot of my first experiences with organizing were actually when I was, or coming into contact with organizing, or when I was a kid. I used to go and protest the Iraq War with my friends and my friends' parents when I was like 5 or 6. And I would always see people like leading the protests and, you know, doing the chants and be like, well, I can't do that. Like, there's no way that that's something that I could do. It seems so nebulous. It seems so far away. And particularly when we start getting into organizing spaces, there's so many things that are happening at once. It can seem really confusing and daunting, and like we can't do it. And we wanted to do this series to really let people know anyone can organize and be a leader, right? We don't want our movements to depend on one charismatic leader who we're all blindly following. We really want to make sure that everybody can be building leaderful movements where people can really come into their own power. So, you know, there's a lot of topics that are going to come up as we learn about organizing, like one-on-ones, how to do coalitions, how to do direct action or mutual aid, whatever. But we really wanted to just give an overview sort of what organizing itself is and how to get involved in the first place. Really grounding that in how there are people who've come before us who've written so many books for us to read, so many things for us to study. And there are people now who are doing that as well. And there's a lot that we can learn. So we want people to come away with an understanding of why we're organizing and what it actually looks like. And really, you know, this presentation itself is a good model. We're trying this out, we're seeing if it works. And for me, that's what organizing is, right? It's just doing it and you're trying your best and you're seeing what happens. All right. Oh, and this is the GIF was from the Babysitters Club, which I hope everyone has watched by this point because it's great. Cool. So we can go to the next one. So when we're thinking about what organizing is, I was saying, you know, I came into contact with it when I was a kid, just from my own, you know, lived experience, my parents' lived experience. But people often lump organizing under every single interaction, literally at all, that's even remotely political. So people will say, I signed a petition today, so I'm an organizer. I went to an event or protest, I talked to a politician, whatever. There's so many different things that people talk about, and some of those are organizing and some of those are not, right? And so if we're looking at these examples that I pulled just from my own archives, the first one, obviously like Twitter and change.org, there's a lot going on those sites. I spend too much time on Twitter personally. A lot of stuff happening. Digital organizing is real, it happens. And also sometimes people just kind of shout into the void a little bit. The middle one is an example of a panel that I was part of. That was more like an education piece. We were just talking about organizing that was happening. And then the third picture is just from a rally that we led on campus a couple years ago. So we wanted to ask you all, and you can feel free to come off of mute, or you can just write in the chat, or you don't have to do any of those things at all. What is organizing in general to you? So where do you think you may have seen organizing happening in like your day-to-day life, or where do you think you may have read about this? And this is really like a low ball kind of answer, but we'd love to see what folks have to say around it. Cool, thank you, Logan. So Logan said getting folks to sign union cards for sure, and getting people involved in signing those union cards is organizing in and of itself, right? So what that actually looks like is people from the union will make house calls, they'll have meetings with folks, they'll talk to them about what the union actually means, what that looks like, definitely organizing. That's a great example. Did anyone have anything else? If not, we can just move on. Cool. All right. So, I mean, basically where we wanted to go with this is that there are so many different skills that people can use that they don't know that they have, that is applicable to organizing, right? Even if we're looking at Logan's example, getting folks to sign union cards, there's usually someone who's hired to like be the union organizer, right? And there are skills that come along with that. How do you talk to people? Are you good at house calls? Are you good at just like hanging out with someone and getting coffee with them one-on-one? Are you good at emailing? Are you good at following up with them later? Those are all skills that individually could really be applied to like many other just like regular day-to-day job situations. But when you're able to use those in an organizing context, they can be really, really powerful and actually change people, right? Because if you get folks to sign a union card, you're building union power and you're getting what you want. So when we're thinking about just defining organizing, this is definitely a term that people have a lot of different definitions for. Just in this context of the presentation, we were thinking of defining it as just bringing people together in general to be building power. That's challenging institutions and also creating a new alternative, right? This thing is wrong and we don't like it, but what do we want to create in its place? What do we want to be living in? What kind of world do we want to be living in? And what does it take to get there? And we want it to be led by us, right? And in doing that work, there's also creating some sort of welcoming space, right? It's not a barrier to other people. It's not shutting other people out. It's inclusive of mutual aid and community. So building relationships with folks. I see your question, sorry, Rex. Building relationships with folks. And also when we create systems of mutual aid, it's sharing and taking care of each other as a community and not letting individuals fend for themselves. Then the last thing is really thinking about intentional and constant study, right? Even with some of the terms we just brought up with power, which I'll define in a minute, there's so many things that we start learning about that there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to know. And when we're doing it together, that's when we can really be building on shared knowledge with each other. And so in the context of like this workshop, we were thinking of defining power sort of as, sorry, I'm just reading this definition that we have. But being able to build like a conscious political, economic, and social agenda with each other, and not thinking of power as a value, right? So it can be viewed as good or bad, but organizing is able to build collaborative like efforts or power by bringing together a lot of people. And Peter is going to define power a little bit later as well when we go more into it. But that does bring us into this part, which is thinking about the fact that words mean things, right? So how many of us have heard somebody talk about organizing and they use, or just anything, and you all are med students too, so, and they use a lot of jargon, right? And they say something and at the end we're like, well, I don't really know what you meant by that. I can't do anything with that because that doesn't make any sense. We really want to be honoring the fact that how can we welcome in people by using language that's actually accessible to people, that they know what it means, what to do with it. And also a lot of the words that were created for us by folks who have been in the movement for a really long time. So for example, as we're talking about stuff like defund the police, as we talk about intersectionality, as we talk about abolish ICE, those words have specific meanings that were created by people for those specific meanings, right? But in what ways might have we seen those watered down a little bit? And maybe people don't realize what it actually means. So if we think about abolish ICE, that's a good one. Abolish ICE means we don't want ICE. We don't want people who are monitoring like undocumented folks. We don't want people who are monitoring immigrants at all. We don't want that kind of surveillance at all. But what some folks have instead interpreted it to mean is they'll say abolish ICE, and they actually mean that they want smaller people, smaller like centers of people who are surveilling immigrants. So they said abolish ICE, but make it smaller, which is not actually what abolish means. So as we go through this presentation, we wanted to have an emphasis on language and the importance of actually defining terms as they mean. So we can go to the next one. We also wanted to think about how, like, where we are in the current context of the US. So obviously there's a lot more than like the United States in this world, but we did want to think about it just in the US context for the purpose of this presentation. So this is an example from The Good Place. I don't know if anyone has seen it. And what it does is the context of the show is basically exploring how the current realities of our situation in the US and in the world mean that the actions that we do have certain consequences that we don't always see, right? And particularly with this, you know, we have current events such as we have prisons, and we have objects in our house that are made by prison labor. And sorry, I got distracted. And the US basically exists based on the exploitation of people, and our organizing is to abolish all forms of exploitation, which really brings us to the point of understanding history as it is, right? So when I was in high school, I was taught that the Black Panther Party was a terrorist party, and all these things that actually aren't actually true, right? So when I began organizing and realized the importance of actually knowing what was going on in this world in a context that was true to the people, that was when we realized how important it was to understand this context. And I see some questions in the chat. Do you think it's okay to just answer them?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's fine.
Okay. So, I mean, this is the personal differences. Actually, sorry, I think this is a good question that might be saved for later, just for time's sake. It is a really good question though, sorry, Elizabeth. I think we can move on to the next one. Okay, so this is, we want to take a minute and think about our own social position of power, right? So what are the ways that individuals have power that's different than collective and systemic power? And when you're looking at yourselves as individuals, what powers might you have? So everyone on this call is a healthcare professional to some degree, maybe, or healthcare adjacent. And when you're looking at yourselves as individuals, number one, what powers do you have as an individual, right? So what are the ways in which you might move through society that where you're not noticing some of the privileges that you might have or powers that you might have? And then when you're looking at yourselves as health professional students, where does that place you, right? So what are the ways in which people who are practicing medicine might have more authoritative knowledge or might be considered to have more authoritative knowledge than other folks? Or what are some of the corporations or systems or people that are controlling medicine and controlling healthcare and being a barrier in between other people who are accessing that care? And what are some of the things that the system tries to push you to do? So we wanted to just have like 30 seconds for people to be reflecting on those questions. And if you wanted to put your reflections in the chat, you can. But if not, that's okay to do internal reflection as well. Cool. Yeah, for sure, Elizabeth. And thank you for typing that. So Elizabeth said, health providers have power to institutionalize people or to get them out of institutions, and also power over the medical record, which impacts patients long-term. Right. Sophia, that's great. Yeah, these are all great. Thank you so much for sharing. And so when we're talking about this, what we wanted people to think of, and we can go to the next slide, really is something that's called positionality. And so positionality, you know, there are so many terms that people use to talk about power. And positionality can be a really useful term to think about, which is essentially like bare bones explanation of what that is when we think about the current society that we live in, right? In a system that is designed to exploit people. Some people are benefiting in some way. Maybe some people have an easier time of doing X, Y, and Z. Positionality is when you think about where you and your identities are putting you in that society, right? So like for me, as like a first generation American, I guess, college educated student, whatever. Where does that place me in regards to other people who are also in the United States? And so when we're thinking about this and the system as a whole, we really want to reframe what power and privilege means. Privilege often can be a way to not actually use your power, right? So people often will just acknowledge that they have privilege and just kind of like say, yeah, I have this thing and there's nothing that I can do with it. What we want to think about is how we can actually be an individual, yes, and positionality matters. That was granted to you by these systems that we're talking about. And that's not something that we can often have a choice over, right? We don't often have a choice over our identities, or we don't. So when we're thinking about our individual privilege, this can really be thought of as tools and tactical things that we can be using, right? So all the great examples in the chat about health professionals and the power that you have. Just because you have that power, I'm not saying you have power that's bad, quit your job, right? That's not where we're going. It means let's figure out how to wield this power. And the way that we talk about privilege, people think that privilege is the problem, right? That you have it and like you're a bad person, whatever. What it actually means is like, let's figure out how to wield it, right? Power can really be good or bad, like we talked about a little bit ago. And if we can use our positionality, if we can use the powers that we have, then we really can make change. There's a framing that can be really helpful to think about in terms of, it was created by Tawana Petty, who's based in Detroit, which is near me, which is thinking about how the damages that privilege causes means that privileges don't actually exist as much, right? Racism, capitalism, exploitation, this harms all of us. And under these systems, people are really miserable like all the time. Okay, the next slide. Okay. And then we wanted to show a quick video to just sort of frame what we were thinking and ground it in something that might be more familiar to you.
I had a black woman come in with back pain who every time she coughed, she would get chest pain, and she was just there with back pain. She coughed, she's like, oh, my chest, and she had a very histrionic personality. And so all the providers were inclined to just be like, oh, okay, let's just give her some cough medicine, So one day I was like, let me put an EKG on you, because I think the New England Journal study just came out that Black women have the worst health outcomes of heart attacks because they're not listened to. So I'm like, okay, let me just try this. So I put an EKG on her, and every time she coughed, she had ST elevations. She was having a heart attack. I said, oh my God. So I called the cardiologist and I said, can you please cath this lady, because I think she has a bridge artery going through her, myocardium, so that when her intrathoracic pressure is increased, it's collapsing the artery and she's having cardiac issues. And he said, well, send her to my outpatient clinic. I said, this woman will never show up to your outpatient clinic. I know this woman, I've known her for 5 years, she will never show up. She's here in the hospital, she's gonna be here for a couple of days with back pain, let's just do a cath. And he refused to do the cath. And so finally I said, I don't want this woman to become a statistic that Black women get worse medical care around heart attacks than everybody else because the medical institution doesn't listen to them. And he said, are you calling me a racist? And I said, well, I think our system is racist, and we're all participants in the system, and I'm trying to check myself. And I had to check myself and actually go, she's saying chest pain, get an EKG. Like, that's what you're trained to do. Why wasn't I doing it, right? And so I think a part of it is just starting to unlearn our own implicit biases that we've been raised with in this society, and challenge yourself with each patient encounter. Now I just challenge myself when I'm looking at Black, Indigenous, Latino person, I challenge myself, okay, what am I not seeing? What am I not asking? Because I'm a part of this system. And through that own self-inquiry and examination, I also now start, talking with my colleagues. Look what I missed.
cool. And I know we're short on time here, sorry. So yeah, just to wrap up that video, what I wanted to talk about was just how we really must understand, and just the next slide, sorry, thanks, Peter. We have to really understand how folks are being bred into a system, right? As medical professionals, what you're taught, who determines the curriculum, that's all really defined as what she was talking about in the video, right? There's so much that's interwoven into the actual policies and politics that we're talking about. And we need doctors, right? We can talk about police and abolishing ICE and abolishing police, and we need medical professionals in our liberated worldview. And so when you're being bred into the system, even if you're actively paying attention, you're probably going to harm somebody anyway. And your existence in the system can contribute to the system's existence, but also you're here as someone who's trying to do better. We need healthcare, and we need people to imagine what healthcare can look like. And this is why it's a constant process, right? And so finally, just medicine has power as an institution of power and control. And understanding that they're really relying on us to be wielding that influence can have a huge impact on the change that we can create. And then Peter, I'll kick it over to you.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for that. We can just sit for 10 seconds and process a little bit before we sort of switch gears here. So what I want to talk about is to kind of build on what Ryan was talking about and move into a little bit of contextualization for this type of organizing work. So the goal from the next series of slides is not necessarily to convey a bunch of detail and have you remember the nitty-gritty, but it's to give you a sort of overview of where to place this type of work and to build a case for doing change-oriented work outside of these institutions that are deeply rooted in exploitive, capitalist, racist structures. So the place that I'm going to start sort of building this landscape to see where the type of change we're talking about, the type of change that organizing creates fits in, is just looking at change overall in a political context. Now, all of these words are defined in different ways by different people, so this is not sort of the be-all, end-all. Again, just sort of an overview. So change, like power, is neutral. There can be progressive change, there can be reactionary change and right-wing change. And so in the most general sense, over here on the right, conservative right wing, we generally kind of mean forces that are trying to unleash market forces and that accept inequality as either part of natural law or a result of individual failure. In liberal and neoliberal, it's trying to mitigate the effects of the market and of capitalism while still supporting and boosting up that system. So a liberal change might be to manage the worst excesses of markets, whereas a neoliberal change might be trying to open markets to new people. So like microloan programs that try to propagate the levers of capitalism in more places that weren't previously a part of the system. Or the Affordable Care Act is a great example of creating these new marketplaces and government subsidies for things to be purchased on the market from private corporations. And the type of change that we're going to be talking about is over here on the left end of the spectrum, which is systemic, radical, or revolutionary change, which are really trying to look at the root causes and the structures of these systems and imagine a world where people have a value just beyond some economic indicator. And so the real difference between everything on the right end of the spectrum and what we're going to be talking about is we are not taking the backbone and the general framework of the dominant structure as a given or as an example of the best system that there is. We're really challenging ourselves to imagine a different world and a different framework that's centered around our values and the things that we believe in. I'm going to kind of breeze through the next couple slides. This deck will be available for your reference afterwards, but it's just going deeper into each of these definitions. It's not really necessary, I think, to understand this presentation. And we're a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to kind of move through them. Okay, so again, this is just summarizing that being able to place ourselves on this spectrum, I think the importance of that will come clear over the next part as I go through the theory of change. But just as an example, I think a lot of folks who maybe have radical values end up working on what we would consider more liberal campaigns because the situation is so bad, they're doing harm reduction or providing a direct service, but this campaign or this work they're doing isn't really challenging that underlying structure at all. And I think we're probably, a lot of us are familiar with some nonprofit that we volunteered at or worked for, where all it's really doing is making this really unequal and brutal form of capitalism more palatable or have more of a moral veneer, and actually propping it up more than it is really challenging those structures in the first place. So I want to move into, I think, what's a little bit more relevant here, which is laying the groundwork for folks to develop or be critical about a theory of change. And what we mean by that is an analysis that's going to guide your overall approach, that's going to connect your worldview, your vision, your values, into the actual tangible day-to-day work you do as an organizer or just as a person. So it sort of says the quiet part out loud. It's going to make implicit assumptions explicit. It tries to be explanatory. So rather than just listing a set of objectives, it tries to actually paint an understanding of why we are where we are and how we get to where we need to be. And so this model is primarily adopted from a book called Power Tools, a Manual for Organizations Fighting for Justice, which will be shared as part of a resource list at the end of this presentation. So these are the sort of models that we're going to be working with, and these will be popping up throughout the next couple slides. First, I'm going to go through the section on the left, which is going to be our analysis of how we sort of understand what's going on in the world right now. And then I'm going to go through the graphic on the right, which is going to sort of talk about some key components to what we try to bring into our organizing work. So I think the starting point that we can all agree with, hopefully if you're in this call, you agree with this, is that our world has problems. Primarily, we're going to name inequality, poverty, oppression, and they are not natural or inevitable. These things are created and they arise out of structures and root causes that we're going to get into. So as an example, again, a lot of medical folks here, tens of thousands of people, up to 70,000 people a year die in the United States strictly due to a lack of health insurance. Only a lack of insurance, not any other factor. So that's not natural or inevitable. And so what's going on there? So these problems all have root causes. They don't exist in a vacuum. They're not random. And just like, so to continue with that example of healthcare, that the root problem that we're going to name here is that healthcare is viewed as a commodity and center of capitalist profit and not as something that people have a right to in a wealthy country. And so because of that, that health insurance is a product that's sold on markets that's unaffordable. Even if you have health insurance, laws permit it to be practically unusable with copays and deductibles and things like that, that these are root causes for why people die due to a lack of insurance. So we start to look at these root causes, and this is where we want to direct the efforts of our organizing in the long term. And it's important to understand what props up these root causes. So this is going to bring us to structures, that these root causes emerge out of how our system is structured. They're not the result of individual bad actors. The CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield isn't saying, oh, I don't feel like giving people whose last name starts with J health insurance. It's a result of the way the entire structure is set up in this country, how markets are created, how people are incentivized to behave. And I think in healthcare, we need to be especially cognizant that the term not-for-profit really doesn't speak to the economic and political environment that these institutions are operating in. They still require fee-for-service revenue streams from insurance companies. They still have operating surpluses that they then use to buy up other practices or other hospitals in the area. They still pay their executives millions of dollars a year. They still pay private lobbying firms to keep things the way they are. So these are structures that are much bigger than any one actor or one institution. And they are intimately related to power. There's a lot of definitions of power. I think we've established that power is neutral. It's about how it's wielded, that either the harm or the good is done. I think a really concise definition of power that I believe Rex told me for the first time that I really like is power can be thought of as either organized money or organized people. So in this case, these structures, there's both organized money and organized people that benefit from these unequal and oppressive structures and that work very intentionally and very carefully to organize and maintain them. And they have 5-year plans and 10-year plans and 20-year plans. And I think this is just something we need to understand that we're up against, that it's not like everybody in the world has the same utopian view of the world. There are people that really are trying to make sure they can keep extracting and exploiting and oppressing because they're benefiting from this. So while tens of thousands are dying every year due to a lack of insurance, CEOs and shareholders are becoming wealthy, using this to entrench their position, spending millions on lobbying, on educational institutes at universities, on think tanks, on reinforcing everything that's necessary to keep the structures in place that keep their power in place. And it's really important to recognize that this power is not necessarily one person that has this power. Individuals do have power, but what we're really talking about here is a network of elite and capitalist power. So there's lots of relationships between all of these folks and institutions. I'm going to go to the next slide for a wonderful sort of web of power from Michigan that Hyan shared. And you don't really need to get into the details here, but I just think it's important to see that money is flowing between universities, between think tanks, between government forces, between corporations, between rich families like the DeVos family, and that this is a class that is supporting itself and that is conscious of its position in society and is taking really intentional steps to maintain that position in society. So unless we have an analysis that sort of makes this evident to us, we're going to not understand what we're organizing against, or we'll be organizing to benefit this system of power. And I think it's also important, and this is going to come up later, that the power of ideas and worldview is here underlying the whole thing. So these structures and these powers try to shape the worldview. They have a reciprocal relationship with the worldview where they both emerge from it and then reflect back onto it. And so just an example in the healthcare realm of like, if you view healthcare as not a right, but a commodity, and markets are the best way to distribute commodities and profits motivate people, and that is really your dominant worldview, then that's going to shape our healthcare landscape. And yeah, and I think, so just paying attention to the language people use and where you think their worldview is coming from. I'm of the opinion that like right now, an example of this is that for 50 years, the conservative movement in this country has been trying to destroy the post office because it's an example of a public service that people use and people like. And there are private entities that also provide that same service. And so it fits their worldview to have those done by corporations rather than as a public service. And so I think in medicine, it's important to reflect on how our own worldviews that we're sort of brought into as we train in this can do a lot of harm, and particularly in medicine, how we in this institution of medicine both shape the worldview in our society and then are also shaped by it. So if the dominant society has a really homophobic worldview, then conversion therapy and the pathologizing homosexuality is going to, was a thing in medicine for a long time. If the dominant worldview is that there are strict gender binaries, then the mutilation of intersex infants in an attempt to fit them into one of these boundaries or these binaries is going to be, that's a worldview reflecting itself through medicine. And so there are some other examples here that I think it's just really important, as we saw in that video, to be aware of and to reflect upon. And so really the whole case I'm trying to build here is that it's important to have an analysis and to understand the system that you're organizing against. Bad things don't exist in isolation. They don't exist in a vacuum. They have root causes. Frequently, people are benefiting from these root causes. And so developing that analysis, I think, is an important part of organizing work. And it's not to say that you need to go be a scholar and get a PhD before you're allowed to get involved or something like that, but it's just that being willing to think critically, to have challenging conversations, to learn more, is an important and lifelong part of this work. And also the case I'm making is that if we really care about collective liberation and our freedom, we will not organize within the system to make a kinder, more palatable version of that system. We recognize that we need to build power outside of that system, and we need to directly challenge these institutions that are doing so much harm in our society. And so this is going to just sort of bring me to some things I think are important, or I try to think about as I approach organizing work. And so part of it for me is that it really starts with values of what do I believe in? What type of world do I want to see? And just trying to really reflect on that and center that and develop that and cultivate that, and make sure that those values are being realized and refined through the different structures that are created through organizing work. Recognizing that, like, asking ourselves whose voice matters in this moment and who needs to be centered. Are we organizing from a place of collective liberation? I think in medicine, it is especially important for us to reflect on the idea of paternalism, of assuming that we know what's best for other people, of assuming that we get to enter into a space in a leadership position, of assuming that we can judge the value of somebody's ideas by their place in a hierarchy that's maybe related to their education or their job title. We have such a power imbalance in medicine between ourselves and our patients that we're sort of indoctrinated into like the silent practice of paternalism day in and day out. And so recognizing that we're constantly in this place of a power imbalance and challenging that within ourselves and challenging ourselves to enter organizing spaces with humility. And yeah, I think for folks that are here at an Organizing 101 session, I think also it's important to recognize there are a lot of people who are doing this work. And if we want to get the best way to get involved and to learn is to seek out that political home and find those folks, and not assuming just because you know a thing or two about the Krebs cycle that you know anything about community organizing. I think another really important thing to recognize is that like individualism is such a dominant part of the dominant worldview that recognizing that movement building is a collective process. It's something we do together. We learn from each other, we build community, we support each other through that community. And in addition, if we want to make large systemic changes that really challenge whole systems, the whole healthcare system, the whole educational system, the whole justice system, we can't do that just by ourselves or in a small group. We're really going to need to find common ground with other movement builders, even if they're not ideologically identical to us. I think an example I've seen personally over the last years in the fight for Medicare for all in the city of Chicago, DSA, which has folks from a lot of different political tendencies, and the Jane Addams Senior Caucus, and the Physicians for National Health Program, and a lot of different groups came together, Democratic Party members, came together to try to fight for this one change. And not only is that important for building the power and of scale and breadth necessary to push for it, we could also develop personal relationships and build trust that allow information, ideas to flow, and that will make the next campaign more viable and stronger. So just recognizing it's a collective process and it's something we do together. Raising consciousness and appreciating that the way we relate to each other, the way we talk to each other, the structures that we build, are these reflecting our values? Are they promoting an alternate worldview that doesn't value, strictly commodification and exploitation and hierarchies? And even you can be more intentional than that when you're talking about raising consciousness. This is a political education session with the idea of getting folks to just think a little bit more about what it means to have a value and translate that value into action in your community and to find a political home to grow in and to learn in and to build community in. And I think that this last part here for me is really important, which is that at the end of the day, our visions are often very distant. I don't expect to see a revolution in my lifetime, but I do feel that if I'm not involved in this work and other folks aren't involved in this work, then we'll not see one ever. And just because I won't see it in my lifetime doesn't make it not a worthwhile thing to strive for. So what that means, though, is that we're going to have to strive to be consistent between what we're working on today, between that and our short-term goals, between our short-term and our long-term goals, and between our long-term goals and ultimately the vision that we want to build. So I think a great example of this for the current moment is thinking about the abolition movement and coming up with a framework to assess proposed reforms to police departments. So a really simple example is that if a reform gives more money to the police department, then it is not abolitionist. And so that's just finding that internal consistency. I'll go to, these examples are taken from a critical resistance handout of just a way to sort of tie together feasible and achievable short-term goals with a long-term vision of a police-free world. And so this slide, don't read it all, it's just included for your reference, but this is just kind of summarize what I was just trying to go through, is that there's going to be this process that'll be iterative. You'll do over and over again as you do this work of what's going on, what are we going to do about it, how are we going to do that? And this is sort of the framework of organizing, of building power outside institutions, and of trying to build lasting and liberatory change. So that's my spiel. Thank you. And I think we can move to a question and answer session. And Taylor, do you have, I'm not sure if folks have questions, if you just want to unmute. I'm just now looking at the chat.
The two questions that came up in the chat were the definition of power, which I think you already went over, and the difference between activism and organizing, which Hwayan and Rex kind of answered in the chat.
Can we just go ahead and say those answers for activism and organizing, say them out loud for the recording?
Yeah, I mean, I know, Rex, if you wanted to jump in as well, because we were a little different. Basically where I was coming from is that I think that, to be honest, a lot of people will define organizing and activism in very different ways, depending on who you talk to, particularly if you ask people, do I identify as an organizer or do I define myself as like an activist? The way that I have like interpreted it for me is thinking about organizing as more of like an intentional long-term process of building with people in community and systems of mutual aid, long-term and very intentionally living with your values. So maybe like a longer term like coalition, like the Chicago CHC for BL. I forgot what that actually stands for, sorry. Or something else, and activism is less strategy and like more short term. There are people who will define themselves as activists who don't necessarily have a group that they organize with or a political home, but have very high visibility. And that's sort of like where I have seen it. That's not something that necessarily everybody defines with, or that's in like all the readings. So I know, Rex, if you wanted to chime in here with what you had said as well, like that's also super relevant.
Yeah, the definition that's been passed on to me, there's a lot of overlap with what Hwayan said in terms of the strategizing, being a little more consistent with like the long-term goals of organizing. But to read what I said, it's just another perspective on this matter, not necessarily right, but perhaps useful reframing. Activism is based in a principle of selflessness that certainly can produce a lot of good for people who have been harmed by a system. However, this selflessness can be draining and take you outside of your political work when it's oriented toward others. The difference with organizing is that it positions you within this fight it can be thought of to be based in mutual self-interest. And there's a recognition that no matter your privilege, there's likely some aspect of psychic or economic harm that's been incurred to you as well. You work to build relationships of people who understand your self-interest and will aid you because it also aids their own self-interest that you have a strong, deep mutual understanding of. It's supposed to be self-sustaining work because it re-envisions a whole new relationship that you have to your community and society. So it's kind of just adding this other personal element of how you position your relationship to some of the harms that have been propagated by a system. Again, not necessarily right or wrong, another perspective that I've that's been passed along to me.
Yeah, and honestly, Elizabeth, like people define this so differently and in different terms and very strongly. So I think, you know, I think taking Rex's definition, which is great, or mine, and just thinking about like what it means in practice will be good. I think it's fine to, I don't know. I identify definitely more as an organizer than an activist. I think other people will think differently. So that's one of the words where I think like definitely like yes, words mean things. And also it is one of the ones where I'm like, this is really something that means very different things to a lot of different people. So that's one of the ones where I'm like, that's okay. As long as you're building collectively with people and focusing on that, that's the more important thing to me.
I would totally agree, Hoyan. I think also the other thing, oh, sorry, I'm Vikrant, I use he, him pronouns. I would also agree with that. I think the other piece is like that activism, like it also feels like my personal experience with it has been like anyone just calls themselves an activist. Like I posted something on Twitter, I'm an activist. I organize a rally, I'm an activist. And there isn't really like a huge understanding what that is. Whereas I feel like, although you said like, you know, these definitions mean very different things for everybody, organizing still has like a little bit more of a clearer understanding of like when you're organizing, you're bringing people together, you're working as a collective. And I think the piece that Rex said about like working, aiding each other in our own self-interest is like the piece of collective liberation, right? That we see our liberation and also in the liberation of others. So if we want to defund the police, that's not just because it harms Black folks, it harms everybody. And we have to understand our own place in that, not only because we want to be allies to folks who are most impacted by this, but also because it impacts us. And also because we need to be able to understand that and understand how like the abolition of the police or abolition of prisons or the military industrial complex or whatever also aids everyone in by building a better society. So I think there's that aspect as well.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for that. Does anybody else have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. Talk to our wonderful panel of experts. Okay, I think we can go ahead and move into our small group session. Vic, if you want to take her away.
Sorry, everyone, our bad. We ended that a little too early.
Yes, my bad. I was too eager to click. Take it away.
It's okay. Technical.
Everyone's almost already back.
Wonderful. At least you know that it works. You know?
Yes, I can click freely now.
Okay, can someone share the slides again?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So we're gonna get into the small groups and we'll end the recording right before we go into the small groups, just so you all know. In the small groups, we're gonna be spending a little bit of time. I think both Peter and Hoyan spent a lot of time really talking about us developing our values and our politics and how that's seen both, that's a part of a personal study and also a communal process. And so we're gonna try to reflect that in the small group. We're gonna do a little bit of personal reflection and also talk about it in our small groups. So I wanted to use the example here for myself. So I think about like what do I mean when I say I'm abolishing ICE? And I'm thinking about my values, right? So in my mind, my values is that I believe that like nationalism is terrible. And I also believe that like we shouldn't have borders, considering the fact that just about every nation is like arbitrarily decided by settler colonial structures. So because I believe that, when I say abolish ICE, I am saying open borders. This is like one of my favorite memes of all time. And then also on the right, I also think about like the value that art places in sharing our values as well. And so this piece of art is by Just X Snow. I don't know if the credit's on there, but if it isn't right now, I will make sure that it does have that when the slides are shared. So yeah, so can we go to the next slide? So in the small groups, we're going to be talking about our own personal politics, our values, and how we can act on them. And then don't really worry about like finishing this today. This isn't like an assignment. First of all, it's meant to be as a jumping off point for you to think of as you continue to develop your own personal politics, as you continue to get engaged. And as we said before, it's a lifelong study. It's personal, communal, and this is just meant to be the first start of that for folks who haven't really done this before, or a continuation for those who have. So with that, thanks everyone who's watching the recording, either now or later, and we'll stop the recording right now.